Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I provide online valuation services for mediation and litigation based in St. Louis, Missouri. Today, we'll be discussing business valuations when the future is unknown and the past is not reliable with my special guests, Josh Shilts and Stephanie Swetland. Josh's practice focuses on complex financial matters and disputes. He frequently lectures on forensic accounting matters and has been involved in hundreds of investigations involving personal and business disputes. He also has provided expert testimony in commercial and family matters around valuation, economic damages, and fraud. He's been qualified as an expert and testified in state and federal courts. Stephanie Swetland is also a licensed enrolled agent and is a QuickBooks Pro advisor for both online and desktop. She is continuing her education in accounting and plans to obtain her CPA license within the next couple years. They are both forensic valuation experts and offer tax advice in the state of Florida. Welcome, Josh and Stephanie. How are you?
Good. Thanks, Melissa. We're just going through our normal winter here in Florida, as you can see, with the golf polo on, a little bit of a sunburn this past weekend. So, we're struggling, but we're managing.
Yeah, we're going to cut all of this out of the podcast because we're in the middle of Missouri and we're still like in a winter spell. And I have boots on today. So I'm just saying, let's keep all of that sun to yourself, right?
No, we'll do. We'll do.
We try to escape to Florida, but I love this topic today because I think people are really confused right now. We have, I've been calling it a pandemic economy, a COVID-19 economy. Pandemic economy sounds better. But basically, we're in a situation with business valuations that we sometimes rely on the past, but we don't know if the past is going to continue. And then we look to the future, but we have kind of an unknown future. So everybody's sitting in the middle, and then all of us kind of are involved in litigation. So that creates a situation where we have to value something at a point in time, regardless of whether it's difficult or impossible. But let's get right into it. So tell me, how has business valuation work kind of changed for your firm during this pandemic economy?
Sure. I think first, we do I would say 95% of the valuation work we're doing is in some form of a litigation setting, whether it's family law, commercial dispute, even criminal in very few matters. And this is a question that's just continuing to come up, right? Because you and I love what you coined it by, the pandemic economy. But as we're going through this phase of COVID-19, people are still getting divorced, businesses are still breaking up, businesses are still being sold. What's the value? And you're right, it's a point in time. You have to go back to the basics. And it's amazing to me when I start asking attorneys what valuation date we want to use. And they look at me and so there's a lot of educating to attorneys, to clients about valuation date. What does it really mean? As far as how our work has changed, there is a lot of true up valuations. And what does that mean? So, for example, if there was a valuation that was December of 2019, but we don't get to a hearing or a mediation setting until June of 2020, we are looking at the books and records and understanding what passive or active forces may have impacted this business, right? So depending on the litigation setting, we could have an example: husband owns a business had a value of $1 million. They go into the pandemic, this business was a tour operator for the cruise line, so they've been shut down. Is that the husband or the wife, whoever owns the business, dissipating or actively forcing the business not to do something versus what is the market. If it's a market impact, those are things that we're really starting to research and understand. And it's not just looking at comparable companies, because a lot of that data is old. It's really looking at the local geography and the specific industry and how they've been impacted. So I say for the most part, we're doing our regular valuation work, and now we're doing more economic analysis and research to provide facts, evidence as to what has happened to the business and why it, right? It's the answering those two questions. What has happened to the business financially and why did it happen? Was it just because the cruise line stopped sailing? They didn't need us to provide any more tours? Or was it somebody saw an opportunity to sit on the sidelines, so they decided to rescind a contract? Or they decided that, there's COVID, everyone's doing layoffs, let me lay people off right now and drive down the value of the business. So there's a lot of forensic accounting and investigative accounting that's slapped next to a valuation at this point. I've seen a lot of people that are just putting out valuations, where I think our work is different than others, is that we're applying some forensic accounting techniques in investigation and research to either support or disprove a claim on valuation.
Yeah.
And I think it's important that we continue to focus on research support and market support, especially during these times, because as you say, we look back to history, but we can't really rely on history because everything is so uncertain right now. Like we say, the past is not reliable. Well, the future, how can we predict the future when we're in such a volatile time? So I think that it's imperative that we continue and that other industry folks also continue to support valuations and their dates with market research to, like Josh said, either support or disprove.
And I think economic research and industry research and market comparables and transactions have always been a part of business valuation. I think just in the past, we've had a consistent economy. And so, the last time we kind of had a break in that consistency was 2008. And so now we're kind of coming back into there. And I don't really see valuation work changing much. I think that we have to go deeper. And if you're in litigation, you have to be able to support your position. And so, because we're not just seeing, Josh, Stephanie, tell me, but I'm seeing a ton of companies that have been exponentially more profitable during COVID or during the pandemic. And we also have to deal with that situation. It's, we hear the restaurants and the hospitality industry has really had great decline. But what about all the other businesses that have skyrocketed, and you're in a divorce? How do you deal with that?
Listen, there is a spotlight on COVID-19 and the negative impact it has psychologically, financially, and that's all we hear about in the news, right? And we live in this society of give me information now, and that's the way it is. The fact of the matter is, to your point, a lot of businesses have done well. They've done better in some instances. Even businesses that you wouldn't think in the restaurant industry, I've looked at financials in 20 compared to 19, and I go, man, nothing fell off. So we had that huge scare that happened in March of 2020, and that really faltered a lot of different things. But if you look at what's actually transcending out of that, and here's a great economic indicator, bankruptcy filings are down in the state of Florida, right? I was just reading an article. Bankruptcy filings are down, I believe, across the nation. How much of that is because of stimulus programs versus how much of that is just, the economy jogging along. Yes, there's been a spotlight. There's all this attention of, oh my, and I think what was impacting people's opinions about valuation was there was this fear of the economy shutting down and ending. Here we are in March of 21. That's not happening, right? Mm-hmm. And the fact of the matter is, Melissa, you know this, when we value a company, we assess its ability to continue as a going concern. So we're always looking at these things. So, I think that overall, the economy has done much better than many people, economists, have ever thought. I think stimulus programs have improved company balance sheets. I'm hopeful, and I know we're doing it more and more, as we're doing not just valuation analyses, but maybe net worth schedules or whatever they mean. What we're starting to have a better understanding is the importance of a balance sheet. How to read a balance sheet, mainly. How to assess the change in a balance sheet going backwards and forwards from a point in time. And then looking at a balance sheet and understanding how it's producing cash. There's been a lot of times where we get hired to do the valuation and, at the 24th hour, we need an income analysis. So we've started doing a statement of cash flows as support for our income analyses, because what I started to see with some companies, Miami, for example, is an area that we do work in. Miami was hit by COVID harder than North Florida, where Stephanie and I are, in Central Florida even, where Stephanie and I are located. So I had a case just recently. We used net asset value on the business. It was all a service business. We won't get into that, right? But it came down to income. Through the statement of cash flows, no, their spending hadn't changed, Your Honor. I agree. But let's talk about why the spending hasn't changed. Well, the credit cards at the time of filing to the time of separation, there was about $50,000 on credit card. Remember all that account receivable in 2019? Started to get paid on that in 2020. But guess what? There's no more accounts receivable because there was no more work going on. And then the third layer of that was the PPP. So I think just at face value, when I'm talking with attorneys and clients, there's this whole understanding of, the economy's done well, there's been earnings. There are instances where you've had a pause in economic activity. I think for all businesses, it's safe to assume that March, April, May, and potentially June of 2020, and I'm speaking to Florida, but I think New York and California, and where your local market, you need to understand the restrictions in place to conduct. But understanding how the balance sheet has changed and what are the sources of cash flow, because a lot of times there's a confusion between earnings and cash flow. And you need to know what your local jurisdiction, but for example, in this case, they kept up with their living, but they've dwindled their net worth and their assets. They don't have that AR anymore. The PPP funds are gone. And now they've been living off of a credit card, which I think is something typical that we've seen. Listen, we live in an economy where the average American has $17,000 in credit card debt. I am curious to see how COVID has changed that, right? And maybe people are not using the credit card as much. Maybe there is a savings, but I truly believe that looking at and analyzing a balance sheet, whether for a business or for personal parties or whatever it may be, depending on the facts specific, is a necessary step now. I think it was done as part of our work, but there's more emphasis on it now.
Yeah, Stephanie, tell us a little bit about some of the things that we might want to look for, because we're going to see so much PPP or idle loans or things like that, because they do affect the valuation. But even just letting people know that they need to look for some of these things, like where are they going to be? How can they throw off the valuation number?
So from what we've done, we're going through tax season, business deadline just passed yesterday. And the way we've kind of handled it, especially regarding stimulus, right? Because I feel like that's one of the biggest things. And in valuation, we use book and tax, right? To reconcile and make sure that, what's actually being reported is in line with the books and there's not too many things out of whack. So I think that there's going to be a big emphasis on M1 and M2 adjustments on the tax returns, because if someone received PPP in 2020 and did not apply or receive forgiveness in 2020, then we still have to report that. So the way you do that is on the M2. It's an M2 adjustment. It's other non-taxable income. And then when it's forgiven, it will go and offset that in the following year. So I think that it's important that valuation professionals understand these items, and also the way that the expenses will be handled, because initially the expenses were not going to be deductible if PPP funds were used to pay them. They turn around and are allowing those expenses. So you should see that and on the P&L, and then the only offsetting thing would be that M2 adjustment for the PPP funds. I think it's also important, though, that we all understand that PPP wasn't the only thing available to small businesses. The EIDL loans were also available. Those loans were payment deferred, but they are still liabilities. The interest rates were great, so it was a great way for small businesses to take out a large loan. Most of them, even on $600,000 of revenue or so, you could get roughly $500,000 at 3.25% or so. So it's a good way for small businesses to refinance debts and things like that. But I think that valuation professionals need to look at that and see.
I would also add on to that, Stephanie, the forbearance agreements that have been out there. I think that a lot of that has helped propped up businesses because they didn't have to pay their debts for 6 months. It's funny, I was talking to a receiver, an individual who does bankruptcy and receivership work, and a little slow right now, but curious to see in the next 90 days or when the forbearance ends, what does that mean? And here in Florida, again, I go back to where I'm at, tourism is a big part of our industry. We're not worried about Marriott. We're not worried about Disney World. We're worried about the local hotel operators that maybe have, a Motel 6 or a First Choice or whatever that were servicing this. They've been skating by because of that forbearance. Anyone who deals with an asset-intensive business where there's real estate or land involved into it, we understand a little bit about the game there for the taxes, but the appreciation. Well, they haven't, their cash flow, you don't really make debt adjustments right now, right? But if you go back and you were to make a debt adjustment, you're starting to see that some of these companies are truly insolvent. And no, their credit card balance is good now, but if they had to pay those debt obligations, I don't think a lot of them will make it. So, Melissa, you and I, when we first met, we talked about the pandemic economy, and we're in certain phases of it. At some point in time, stimulus and forbearance will end. What will that look like? And sorry to cut you off, Stephanie.
You're fine. I think, but to that point, I think that it's also important that as professionals, we recognize that. And so if we have a valuation date that's, say, November 30th of 2020, and that's dead in the middle of forbearance and things like that. So then we need to make sure that we do those cash to accrual adjustments to look at that. And if those debts were due now, what would that look like? Even though they're not, we know that that's going to happen, so it should be considered.
I agree. Going back to your first question, Melissa, I'm seeing a lot more interest in how we do valuations.
Right.
Here's an equity valuation versus an enterprise valuation. This is how the two can join. Here's liquidation value versus a going concern value. And those terms that, the three of us, we understand those terms. And how many times have we said, I don't understand why the attorney doesn't understand that? Well, it's our job to educate them on that. And so there is a lot more explaining these, what I call blocking and tackling concepts, to attorneys, to clients, and aligning, hey, a liquidation value means we're stopping operations today and we're fire selling. Going concern, well, let's talk about a going concern and what that means. You know, when it comes to family law here in Florida, discounted cash flow, there's a general agreement, if you will, nothing written in statute, but we don't use discounted cash flows because those are cash flows in future marital efforts. So we're doing a capitalization of earnings. Well, if I had free cash flow of 100,000 for 4 or 5 years, and I'm doing a November 20, and the cash flow is 40,000, do I do an average? Do I believe this company? You know, and as you know, in litigation, we don't get to do a range of value. We don't get to sit up there and say, hey, based upon this assumption, based upon that assumption. We got to come up with a number, and we got to be, so the forensic aspect of making sure that your assumptions are supported with facts. What evidence supports that? And I've been talking to other professionals around the country who, Josh, how do you handle this? Because just, you know, it comes down to reasonable certainty. How certain are you of these assumptions? Are you accepting them just because the attorney? Well, if you're going to do that, you better state that and just be very transparent there. Otherwise, you as a professional could get yourself into trouble because they think you're the one coming up with it. So,
well,
you know,
and I think even current financials are becoming even more important. You know, if we're sitting right here in March, you know, normally I'd be like, well, wait till the quarter's up, or, you know, we'll look at a June date. But now it's like, no, I really need to see every month, because like I've told a lot of people, like, we're a year into this pandemic. I think we have another year to 18 months to kind of this still economy where we're trying to integrate back. And so in that perspective, in the past, we could just look at, okay, give me 3 to 5 years. Now it's like, no, I really need to see every month. Like, I need to see how you're progressing. Is this progressing forward? Is this stagnant? Like, did you have a good month? Right. And it popped up, but it's not really moving the needle. And then
understanding the whys.
Yeah.
Why was May of 2020 better than April? And then June did this. Like, understanding that. I'll go a step further. Talking to a professional, a colleague, a cohort of ours out of Texas, Richard Claywell. Richard's been doing this, as he likes to remind me, when I was 2 years old. But Richard brought up a really good point, and I was thinking about this. You know, business cycles every 5 to 7 years are a general consensus. Instead of asking for the past 3 years, should I be asking for the last 7 years? Why am I asking for the last 7 years? I want to see how this business does in a cycle. I want to see if they were in a negative situation, how did they came, so I can assess management. I think going back to the pandemic economy, as we've talked about, 2 key questions that I would ask myself is, has my customer, has their purchasing patterns changed? How do they buy? I think for a forensic and valuation services, our customers are attorneys and individuals or business owners. I think because of Zoom, we are able to market ourselves to a broader array, number one. But stepping away from our industry, I think the way that people vacation is going to change. I think the way that people use a grocery store has changed. I don't, listen, I got 4 kids, 10 and under. My wife and I we love to go to Publix without the kids because it's like a mini vacation for us. But my point is, am I going to completely abandon DoorDash or any of that stuff? No, absolutely not, right? So it's very interesting. And that's what economists do, right? They're psychologists who try and paint a picture of the future. I can't use that. I was an attorney who came up with that. But I do like to point that out. As CPAs, we look at the historicals and try and understand how is this historic? What's the story it's telling us? And you're saying it right there, Melissa. I think, now and that's why I love these conversations. We share thoughts, we get ideas. I think it's prudent for any valuation analyst to get month over month financial statements from March of 2020 to year to date and start looking at changes and fluctuations in the income statement, the balance sheet, and start understanding what happened in June of 2020, what happened in November of 2020. Sales went up. Are you done? Like, what's going on here? Is it recurring or non-recurring? So there's just a lot more questions, because those of us that are doing this valuation work in litigation, we know that if someone is halfway decent on the other side, these are the questions I want to know and I'd want to ask, and they should be asked. For our colleagues that do gift and estate or do M&A, I would warn them, 2 years is not that far along, and hindsight's always 2020. When the IRS or a shareholder goes, why did I sell at this price? Keep these different things in mind.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that even in all of the litigation that we're seeing and all of the work, we've done some estate tax work for a death and for a family member that owned the business or something like that, right? And it was in the middle of 2020. And it was interesting because, I said, oh, well, the PPP loan is forgivable and blah, blah, blah. And they kind of reminded me, they're like, yeah, but we didn't know that then, And so it was interesting because that was even from a client. And they're like, at the time that this, and the valuation is at the date of the death of that person, at that particular date, it wasn't sure if it was going to be forgivable. It wasn't sure if we were going to, like, how it was even going to work. We just knew that we were getting the money. And, and so then it kind of created that we have to kind of, going back to basics is true. I went back and thought, okay, was it known or knowable as of that date?
Ron Senior, who those of us in the valuation community, he's one of the names. He just wrote an article in BB Update, and it talked about known or knowable. And then Hitchner came out with his COVID timeline. Mm-hmm. That's probably some supporting documentation that us that are signing off on these valuations are going to want to have, right? What was known or knowable, and really understand those definitions. That's why I kind of pause those out at that time in the data valuation, because you're right. February 28th of 2020 was very different than March 30th of 2020, right. And what we knew and what was knowable. Same thing as we sit here today, right? Like, the President of the United States is telling a lot of us that most of us should be vaccinated by this summer. That's what we know today. So I think you're right, Melissa. When we're doing our economic and industry research, it's good to probably go into the local newspapers or journals and see what was being communicated to the business owners and individuals at that time, and really put yourself in April of 2020, right?
Because it was a completely different feel. I mean, we were all kind of like hyper concerned, and it's hard to go back to that time. But when I did, I was like, you're right. Even if we looked at, what the IRS was saying about the PPP loans, that was not official at that date of valuation. So now you have to say, okay, how does this play into it? And I think it's a lot more questioning. It's a lot more analysis. It's a lot more work for us. Yes, we have Zoom trials now and things are a little bit different. But I think another thing, like if we talk a little bit about how divorce has changed, I think that, and maybe Stephanie can give us a little insight into this, but we still have to look at income to the parties. And so when we have this dip, what if people lost their jobs? What if people got, under employed? What if people are in charge of their own business, but they decide that they're going to take less money, right? How does that impact maintenance, child support, all of these things? And we're having to do a lot more analysis around that piece too.
Agreed. And I think that to that point of specific income changes where, one of the spouses is the 100% owner of the small business and they specifically change their W-2 wages, I think that it's important to look at distributions from those entities, because a lot of the time, W-2 wages are just to satisfy the reasonable comp requirement of the IRS and not necessarily what they're actually taking in cash to facilitate the home. And I think a lot of that is seen in distributions. So I think that it's important, just in general for valuators to look at that and consider that when we're talking about support payments. I think it's also important to consider, back to stimulus, those cash flow items that are going for personal support, even throughout the marriage. And specifically divorce changes, I think that people are scared, for lack of a better term, to get into a divorce right now because there is so much uncertainty. At the beginning, we thought the divorce rates were going to go out the roof because, oh my gosh, everybody's going to be cooped up in the house together and this is not going to work, And I think that we did not see that specifically because of the volatility, and people were just like, you know what? I can't stand you. Maybe I don't even want to be with you anymore, but we're going to stay here because this foundation is solid and we'll worry about that after, And so I think that for the ones that did actually file for a divorce and are going through this, and so we have to value their assets at these pandemic economy dates, I think that it's important to look at risk appropriation for investments specifically in those kinds of situations.
Yeah, all good points. And I think that sometimes business owners will say, well, I don't have control over my W-2 wages. I don't have control over distributions. That's the company money, and those, there's still a lot of games being played. But I also think that a lot of people, regardless of the litigation, are looking at alternative ways of getting through it. So mediation or collaborative divorce, or really, I feel like it's kind of just a hybrid. Josh, we do so much of this that it's like, we don't need to be in court. We don't need to be in mediation. Yeah. How about we just sit down and talk? How about we all get in on a Zoom, right?
I think one of the positives, right, specifically when we talk about divorce, because I guess what troubles me in divorce is, my job is to face value the assets, tell you what X and Y is. I like doing divorces where my client spends X amount with me, and guess what? It pays off tenfold. But one of the benefits I'm seeing is what you're talking about. People are definitely being more conscientious of what they are spending. So instead of having, 60 days of discovery issues, it is simple as, hey, let's just pick up the phone. Let's get this done, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of having the dueling experts on the stand, it's, what's your value? This is my value. Are we missing something? Let's understand it. I have a divorce right now. Husband is a partner in 2 different hotels, right? Very forthcoming to me. He's not my client. This is what's going on, showing me month over month, right? We've been in this litigation probably 8 months. Sends me monthly updates to keep me apprised of, and was very optimistic about what's going to happen, right? And so being open to those different types of things. On the flip side, I still see what I call the regular, bad actors, if you will, still playing the games that they do. I think an extra little wrinkle in there is PPP funds. I've probably in the last year seen 2 or 3 what I would consider fraudulent transfers of PPP funds, depending on how that term is described in whichever venue. But where I'm seeing, people just taking that PPP money and the payroll's fine and everything, but instead of saving it there and shoring up their balance sheet, they're going and doing home renovations, or they went and bought a new boat. And not only is that potentially problematic in a divorce or business partner disputes, I've seen some business partner disputes. Now you're talking about having some issues with either the IRS or the Small Business Administration. I know there's been a lot of talks about, who the SBA is going to audit, right? Stephanie, we've kind of
talked about that. To that point, right?
There's audit risk out there. Go ahead.
Right. When we first started talking about PPP, we really pushed to the people that we were talking to in all of the different settings. Set up a separate account, and when you process payroll, transfer the funds. When you pay your rent, transfer the funds. That way it's a clean movement. And I think that the people that will suffer, per se, will be the ones that did not do something like that. And they continued to take those large cash sums out of the business account for personal uses, whatever the personal use was, right? And we know the SBA is definitely going to audit anyone that received over $2 million in PPP funds. And I think that people that took the second draw PPP will also be looked at more heavily than any others under $2 million in the first round. And I think that IRS has already told us that they plan to double their audit of pass-through entities and small business self-employed individuals. So I just think that it's important that we're aware of that, and that we know that the IRS they don't have to come now, right? They can come up to 3 years later. So I think that those are some important things to also consider when we're really scrutinizing PPP funds or other stimulus monies and things like that.
And if we see that kind of activity when we're doing our analysis or review, we have that discussion with the clients about the potential riskiness, right? Like, okay, so Josh, you're telling me you saw that, my wife took the PPP funds and went and bought a Mercedes with it. What does that mean? That means that we're not going to argue over a difference of $100,000. We're going to get in and we're going to get out of here, because I think there's a potential for audit risk, which could go to you, to all of your different,
which brings on other tax items, right? So there is available relief for those things in certain instances. Again, it goes to the individual of what was known or knowable by that person. So did they have access to the accounts, or do they really, they didn't know, so they can truly get innocent spouse relief and not be subject to the liability that comes of that audit.
Well, and that's what I am seeing in some divorces. It's just like, well, they use the PPP to pay off the credit cards. And I was like, okay, but you benefited from, like, for you to open a can of worms may not be super beneficial, especially if you don't have exact knowledge. Like if you're just making assumptions and and things like that. I'm like, and a lot of times both spouses could be owners. Like even if it's just in name or on paper. And so you are an owner of that. Somehow you have been electronically signing your tax returns and things like that. So I think, there's a lot more blurry lines, but it's also because of these stimulus coming in. Sometimes I'll look at income statements and I was like, whoa, you guys had a different year. Well, they're booking things in the wrong place. So it's arbitrarily making the income for 2020 look higher because they booked the PPP loan coming in as a revenue item, right?
Yeah.
And so,
I think that's why it's so important that when we request financial statements and supporting documents, bank statements, credit card statements, we also request general ledgers, because the general ledgers actually tell us where those transactions were booked. It's funny, we were preparing a tax return and we looked into the revenue account, and there's all kinds of non-income and expenses in the revenue account. So it's like, not necessarily that they're not deductible, but they're just not in the right place, right? So we're understating income and understating expenses by just netting them. So I think it's important that we're looking at general ledgers for things like that, especially when we're preparing things like statement of cash flows and other things, because most small business owners are not bookkeepers. And even if they have some accounting knowledge and they're familiar with the double entry system and things like that, they still don't have the full grasp of GAAP, IFRS, et cetera. And when we're evaluating, we're always, comparing mostly against public companies. So you have to be able to transition from one to the other.
I mean, I think if there's ever a time for business owners to kind of start to engage with a CPA or a bookkeeper, it's now, because things are so confusing and they're presenting documents, especially in a divorce. I mean, I had a recent one lately and I was like, I can tell that your books don't really tie to your tax returns, which usually I'll just see like you didn't pay for the accountant to go into your QuickBooks and make those changes to tie to your tax return. But I'm just going to tell you that's probably a good idea to do right now, because if somebody else starts to see it, because we've seen it during the pandemic, we've seen a lot of buyers come to companies and say, hey, you've weathered the storm, you're profitable. Are you profitable? We assume you're profitable, and we want to buy your company. Yep. And they come to us and they're like, okay, but what is it worth? And then we start looking at their financials and I'm just like, what happened, man? Like, how is this such? But they just don't know how to handle some of the stimulus and their books are kind of a mess. The other thing is a lot of times they need to get forgiveness of the PPP before the transaction. So there's right now, operating as a business is really, it's almost imperative to get other advisors involved, because there's a lot more now that you can do wrong, than in the past, I think.
Agreed. I think there was a recent survey about the hardest tax seasons in the last 50 years. And number one was this tax season. Right. Number two was last tax season. And then number three was like 1986 or something. So I know we all laugh about it, but
but it's very real. And we're still, the changes are happening all the time.
Yeah, the American Rescue Plan came out, and now the unemployment, which was taxable, is not taxable. So,
you think about, to that point specifically, you think about all of the people that started filing and just having them in queue with the IRS in January that have filed. And so now all of those returns, and the IRS is not accepting superseded returns right now, which are amendments that are filed before the actual deadline of the return. So you can't even amend those until after April 15th. So it's going to be a continuation. And I think here in Florida, we've seen one in 04, 05 with the hurricanes were really bad. We went through like tax season for 2.5 years. And I feel like it's the same thing now because it's not going to end. I think another important piece of legislation that came out of the pandemic and that really does affect small businesses that a lot of small business owners do not think about is the Secure Act. So most of the time they can't put a plan in place, right, a retirement plan in place after October 15th of that current year. Now, because of the Secure Act, they were allowed to do that up until the due date of the return, and still not to be funded until September 15th. So I think that that's also an important consideration, both for tax and valuation purposes, because at the date of valuation, they may not have known that they were going to make this contribution. However, that's a big piece that does affect the future value, right? So even if it's included in a footnote, it's just a considerable item. I think that it's important that, valuators and tax analysts are aware of that and are looking for that, and when we're working with our clients, I think it's important to educate your clients. We have some clients that make a lot of money and they don't necessarily spend a lot of money. Well, you can save tax dollars and instead put them up for yourself. And I think that that's another thing to be considered.
Well, and I think that a lot of what we have been talking about having to do with the valuation work has just clearly indicated that we have to do a lot more work, maybe in the past, to support it. But how even has your expert witness work changed? Because I talk to a lot of attorneys around the country and then all of the work that I do, and it's really different now. But what are you guys seeing?
You know, expert, it's very different being deposed or on the stand in the safety of my office, right? Like that's very different. I don't like it as much. Obviously, I have a loud voice that can help in certain, like I spent many years trying to build rapport, you understanding my voice inflections and all of that. Now I'm having to rethink that on Zoom.
Yeah.
I think that, when you're on Zoom, obviously you still want to look professional. I've seen other experts and they got their whole binder and they're kind of going through that. And the one thing that I've noticed in Zoom is I can read the judge's face much easier. And for me, that's who I'm talking to when I'm on the stand. I'm talking to the judge or the jury. So I'm focused I have a better ability to focus more on what's the judge. Are they really in tune? Am I combing them over with information? What can I do? I've started to talk to attorneys about me being in charge of the exhibits because I'm able to then put the exhibits up. And that's one thing that's changed. And I'll be honest, I'm actually excited about it, is more demonstrative exhibits. Stephanie will attest to it. I'm a geek when it comes to Excel and charts and graphs because I love to not only tell a story, but then support a story with real data and go through that.
He likes to turn the data into a picture because, his famous line is, you're talking to a 5-year-old. Well, when you talk to a 5-year-old, the best way they understand is pictures.
Right.
People don't understand what we do. That's why we do it, and they rely on us to do it. So I think it's a really good way, and I like that about what we do, is taking the data and really turning it into a picture for them to see.
We just did an analysis of 7 pass-through entities with two main income sources and all this blah 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 blah. And there's 2 attorneys and the client, they're like, we don't get it. We created a picture. There was a pizza franchise, there was a hotel, there was a motor oil company, and we showed with pictures how the money flowed to what entities. One of the entities held a private plane, the other entity held some commercial real estate. We showed how the money was divvied up there, and then how it eventually trickled down. We were able to do that on a 2-pager. Right? If I'm trying to show that with financial statements, I got an Excel file that's going all the way down to at least line 1000.
Yeah.
So I think there's opportunity for us to improve our deliverables instead of just having, a discounted cash flow or a capitalization of earnings or a listing of comparable companies. How are they comparable? Answering questions like that. So I think there's opportunity. Again, I miss being in the courtroom. I'm not going, I really missed it. I think there's a different feeling, right? Like I used to play football in high school and college, and there's something, anyone who plays a sport or was involved in, my daughters are in dance. Okay. So I can hit on both genders of it. The butterflies feeling, right?
Yeah.
I still have them, but there's something about being in a courthouse with a judge in the robe there and the other attorney that we're lacking right now. I think our attorney friends too, a lot of them are some love it, and a lot of them hate it. I miss going there and feeling the emotions. It's very emotionless right now.
Well, and it goes back to like the separation of like work and house, right? A lot of people are working in the house. I totally get. But even this is like when I came out of my office, like I had the suit. I was going, like you were ready, like you were going into battle. You knew what to expect. Well, now every single court system has a different. So we just did one that there was no capability to do demonstrative exhibits or to even show the exhibit to everybody at the same place at the same time. So everybody was pulling, okay, do you have exhibit 4? Okay, yeah. Yes, I do. Oh, yes, I do. Okay, yes, I do. Oh, can you hear me now? Oh, you can't hear me now. Like, and it was like we had to hyper prepare for, 2,000 pages of exhibits. Where was everything? If they asked me this question, where was my data to support the answer? And so I kind of had to do a cheat sheet for me and the attorney to say, okay, well, if they go down this path, here's the supporting document. If they go down this path, here's the supporting document, because you don't know if they're going to, like half the time you think, well, they're going to catch me somewhere, and then they never do. So you're hyper prepared.
We always created binders. I grew up professionally with give me my binder.
Yep.
And I would tab it when I thinking about questions or thinking about points. And I got to thank my staff, because it was probably 2-3 years ago that they basically forced me into electronic binders, right? And they go, Josh, we can do this for you electronically. I was set in my ways a little bit. I like the feel of it, the flipping. So we've been doing electronic binders, and that's helpful, because you're right, man. There's so many times I'll be on the stand and I get a question and I'm ready to hit back on it, right? And I don't have my binder that I can. It's really hard to show on Zoom. This is the number I'm looking at, as opposed to being able to have it up there and I can go through it. So, it's a little bit of a change. I think it's not going to go away. In talking to attorneys, I think that, from a client perspective, it's cheaper, it's more efficient. We got to recognize as experts, we're only one piece of potentially the entire case.
Yeah.
So we get it from that standpoint. I think it's a skill that we all need to sharpen up. Listen, you got to know how to work Zoom. If you don't know how to work Zoom right now, like, you cannot be a testifying expert. I don't know how you would, right?
Right.
So you have to change and adapt to those types of things. And
you need to get good at it, because every court, if they have a different system, right? They're not all Zoom. They're hyper secure. And even in some cases, so it's really.
I'm having my assistant ask, what is the hearing on? Is it Zoom? Do we have the ability to share demonstratives? Okay, here you have Mr. Shilts' expert report. Do we need to go over that prior so he can show you the different things into it? Because I'm not sitting down in a conference room with an attorney and walking them through, hey, this number on page 2, if they ask that question, we got to go to page 5. Because that's where so there's a lot of that's been missed out. We're skating by, but we're kind of evolving, if you will. The profession is obviously changing because of the remote capabilities, and there's good and bad with it.
Yeah, no, I think you just have to be. What I've seen is the more you're prepared, especially if you're a younger expert, your preparedness could counterbalance the other really, really senior expert on the other side. And it gives
everyone wants their expert to come across as sharp.
Yeah.
And there's nothing, can you hear me? When someone says that, there's a reaction like, this idiot doesn't know how to work Zoom and he's going to tell me about that. Perception's reality, folks.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Walking up there in a nice suit with a sharp tie on, you're creating an image. Melissa, you've been on the stand. I've been on the stand. Stephanie will be on the stand. Stephanie does know about the image is everything in the courtroom. How do you have that image of professionalism and everything you're doing into it? There's a reason, folks, that I moved my desk over here, by the way. I have all those things hanging on the wall So, I kind of do it on purpose as an intimidation factor, but also to kind of, dress it up. Let's not, I don't think it looks good to show up, underdressed, not shaved, right? Like, and you see people do that because they're comfortable, but we're still experts, and we have to have, for us, at least in our firm, we take our professionalism to another level when we're in those types of settings.
Yeah. And one thing that I think has been a big difference, which probably doing these podcasts have helped me a little bit with that, is you have to be very mindful of your facial expressions. And so I will watch when when I'm testifying, I'm only looking at the judge. Like I'm just putting the judge's picture right front and center. And sometimes I've done this with stickies. I will sometimes even put a sticky on like the other expert or the other attorney, because they're always doing like those like, oh, what?
Yeah.
I'm being over.
No, I know what you mean. Like when your counsel, right?
Right.
They'll show facial expressions that you go, oh my God, what did I say that was so wrong, kind of a situation.
And then it causes you to have to rethink your initial train of thought, because now you're focused on what they're thinking instead of what you're portraying.
Right. And the other thing though I'm also doing is like I want, like there was a situation where I thought I was going to come back on redirect or something like that, right? And we're looking at the judge's face when the other expert is, like, did he miss the mark? Did I hit the mark? Because at some point you got to quit, because Zoom fatigue is a thing. And now we're taking trials that, normally would be in person, and we're doing them online. And by the end, if it's 4:00 on a trial date, like you don't want to be making everybody continue to be up there to belabor the same points. Like if you got it, you got it. But most of the time, like if my attorney is cross-examining the other expert, I have to be watching the judge's face to see like where we missed, where we hit, and then say, okay, you got to go back over this issue, or we got to come back on the stand, and because I don't think he got it. And I'm also looking for the judge to like back me up, right?
I think an area that has been negatively impacted is mediations. So prior to the pandemic, it was very common for me to go to mediation. Now, during the pandemic, it's, Josh, we'll call you if and when we need you. Okay. Well, first of all, from a scheduling perspective, it's real, what am I focused on that day? Number one. Number two, I get a call at 2:00 and it's a question. I have no context. I don't know what was said or anything. So, I've started to talk to attorneys and say, look, you're asking me things. I don't know the context. What that puts me into a real scary situation. I could say something thinking we're talking in a certain context. The next thing I know, I got a malpractice suit. So look, if you want me for mediation and you want to do it that way, I got to know specifically what's going on. This whole, Josh, we're going to call you and we want you to be a super computer calculator thing. I think mediations has become very difficult because it's like we're parachuting in at certain points of time. And I think that the client sometimes doesn't get the overall value of the financial professional. There's certain things that are said, there's emotions that we can't pick up on that maybe we can help resolve it. And so I've found mediations to be, for me, I mean, we've been successful in how it is. A little bit of hair pulling on my side, because I want to, the professional in me wants to be in there and engaging my client and helping. And I'm like a caged lion outside of a beef factory is how I feel sometimes. I'm like, what's going on? It'll be 5:30, 6:00. I'll text the attorney, like, what's going on? Oh, we got done at 4:00. Well, give me a call, man. Like,
at least let me know.
Yeah. Well, and I think mediation can be successful, but I think that the litigation, the lines are getting a little blurry. Like I had attorneys call me the other day from their cell phone. Thank goodness. I was just like, this is Melissa, whatever. And they're like, "Hey, Melissa, we have the judge on here too, and we wanted to ask you." And I was like, what? So like
Yeah.
that would never
Me
really
first to give you a
happen.
heads up.
Yeah. I was like,
And
you could have
listen,
texted me. What if I
Right.
said, "Yo, what's up?" And then it's like the judge is on there. I'm like, I
But
didn't.
more importantly, too, we're credentialed professionals. I don't think our insurance carriers want us to opine on anything in that kind of a situation, right? And
Right.
my biggest fear is I give a number in a certain context and it's the wrong context. And the next thing you know, it's the whole telephone. Well, Josh said this. Yeah, Josh said this. And before it gets back around to Melissa, Melissa goes, "The hell is Shilts talking about?"
That's not even something he would say.
As opposed to just the two experts talking it out.
Yeah.
Which happens in mediation. A lot of times in my mediations, it was, "Josh, we're going to put you and the other expert in the other room." Great. 5-10 minutes later, boom. And if we disagreed, we at least knew the points we disagreed. So, there's some of that. There's always the good and the bad with it. I'm hopeful we'll get back to a day that we're in those pressure cooker situations again. I got to be honest with you. It's one of the reasons I like doing this. I like the match of someone trying to best me. I miss that pressure put upon myself. I probably didn't realize it. The pandemic has made us think about a lot of things. Stephanie probably heard me bitch a lot of times about, you don't understand how stressful it is. I miss it.
Yeah.
I really do.
I do
It's
too.
the competitive nature. It's like, I feel like to be an expert witness, to be in litigation support services, you have to have that competitive drive, because I feel like that's the underlying characteristic that really pushes us to do our best work, to put our best work.
If you don't have butterflies in the stomach, don't go on the stand.
Right. Well, and what a letdown at the end when you like when things go really good, right? Because I'm always like, experts don't win cases, right? You have to have a good legal foundation. We come in and give a good financial picture. Like we're just wrapping it up in a good story that makes sense, that's logical. But at the end, it's just like you turn off the Zoom and you're like, "Good job. Okay. Well, okay. I guess I'll answer emails."
Yeah.
And it's such a build up to that kind of event. Now,
We're missing the excitement in our work.
I know.
That's what we're talking about here, guys, is, I'm sure if we were having this conversation 18 months ago, we'd be like, court again.
Gotta go to court.
Yeah.
But the victory lap of walking out of the courthouse is what you really miss, right? Because you don't get to walk out of the Zoom. It's just like you said, Melissa, okay, I'm done now. I guess I'm going to check emails or go back to working on that article I was working on, or, whatever it is, instead of, I think we did a great job walking out of the courthouse.
Yeah, the little kid in me misses walking out of that, because that's what I aspired to do for so long, and now that's been taken away, really. So,
and a lot of times it's a year, 2 years. I just had one that was 3 years of work, and you have that kind of finality, and then you're like, okay, I just can't, I need to like a transition period. But I have seen where I've had to value, or I've had to testify for like a pension valuation, which kind of takes me like a half an hour, maybe an hour, total to do. And so when it's like a smaller financial thing, I think it's been great, because they'll be like, you can come on at 2, you'll be done by 3. And I was like, now that saves me a lot of time. When it's the big things that we're going to be testifying all day,
entities that you're valuing, and there's pass
it's a lot.
And due tos and due froms. It's real hard on Zoom. I agree with you. If it's a very narrow project or scope, it's very effective. But when you gotta put on the show, for lack of a better term, because it's just that voluminous, Zoom is tough.
And I think Zoom hypothetically is saving time. I don't really think Zoom is saving a lot on complex trials because we're all having to hyper prepare. Whatever amount of time we're saving in travel, we are 10 times more prepared, 10 times how am I going to show it? And the reality is if we stay in this field of expert testimony, we have to be as good, like I've been doing expert testimony for 20 years. I know, Josh, you've been doing it for several decades too. Now I'm really good in person. Now I have to escalate how I do it in this space. And it takes a lot of time. And then it takes experience, right? Because there are some things that I think I was almost over prepared for some of mine because I was like, I can't look like a fool. You got one time. Like I can't have a snafu of a mic or a camera or my internet, or like right now, my computer was like, I think I'm going to die because you didn't plug me in. And I'm like, like those types of things. The other thing is it throws you off. Like when you're in court and the attorney is questioning the other expert and like they're going down a great path. And then all of a sudden they're like, oops, I think we lost Mr. X.
Yeah.
It throws you off.
There's no way to tell if that lost person was intentionally lost. Yeah. If they were like, oh, this is too stressful, let me hit the end button real quick and then I'll rejoin after I can regroup. You don't know. And to your point earlier about, kind of the young professional versus the senior professional, I think that Zoom kind of plays that leveling factor because the younger professional is going to have a much easier time navigating the technological factors. However, the seasoned experienced professional has that preparedness. So I think it kind of, it in some way tilts the scales a little bit to try to level them out.
I will tell you the technological advancement, or if you are sophisticated technology wise, will portray way better than if you are skilled and know how to talk about evaluation, because you just really, think about it. If you're like fumbling around, like, where's my mic? Is my earphone? Like you look like the child, right?
Yep.
And it shifts because when we come into court, we're like, we're the expert. We're the smartest person in the room. Like, we know this. And then you're like, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, can you hear me now? Oh, yeah. Wait. Oh, let me change my camera. Oh, let me
I can't hear you. I can't see you.
You look like the young, you don't even look like a young expert. You look like you're in grade school.
We get it together.
Like my kids know how to do this.
You look outdated and you start to question how hip to it are you.
Well, and then you start questioning. So, okay, if you can't run Zoom and you're an expert and you've been doing these Zoom trials now, we're 18 months into this just about, what else have you not kept all the way up on? Is it research? Is it theory? Is it methodology? What else are you lacking? Because for as sophisticated as these web sharing platforms are, they're fairly simple for users.
But it shows that you either don't have interest in becoming better or you haven't done it enough, and because again, and then the other thing is, like, think about it. Proportionately, we only have 10 or 15% of trials that actually go to court and have a final trial. So we have all these cases that settle somewhere in the middle. So you could be doing hundreds of cases and still not know how to testify on Zoom. And I think that right now, if you're a younger expert or you're going against more sophisticated experts, your leveling is the technology, but you have to come in and you have to be on point, including your facial expressions, because I will tell you, it is hard to not like raise an eyebrow or furrow your brow or be like, when somebody says something stupid. And I think that those are also the skills. So I will actually sometimes move. I don't think I can do it here, but I can move it so that I'm looking at another screen, like over here, and I'm looking at all their faces, but they're not looking at my face. Right. Well, that's not always acceptable either, because in a lot of courts, people are saying, like all the people that are in that trial, all the plaintiff, the defendant, everybody needs to be facing the camera and facing forward and have the camera on, right? In some areas, not all, obviously everybody's different, but in some areas, you can't have your camera off. You don't get to have your camera off. So now you have to be privy to now it's, I look as good as my weakest link on the team, right? Which my weakest link could be the client. The client might not do a lot of Zoom, and they might show up with like a crazy background or like causing, so to me, I was like having conversations with the attorney and client. I was like, you guys can't be the reason why I look bad. Okay. So do you have your camera ready? Do and I was like, why don't we just test it out? Why don't we practice this? Why don't we see how it works? I've talked to some attorneys that are still sending the exhibit books to the judge and the other side, because even if they know how to do the technology, if they get all flustered, right, then they at least have the book to rely. And a lot of judges still want the book, because they don't want to flip, it's just easier to flip than to say, okay, can you go to page 275 of exhibit A, triple, quadruple A, like all of these things. And then we're just wasting time. And in a Zoom fatigue environment, the more time you waste by not actually testifying to actual information, you are just making everybody frustrated by the process, and they're not even hearing you. So, I mean, I think there's
encouraging the fatigue, right? Because not only are you fatiguing yourself, then that fatigue is also applied to everyone else.
Yeah.
So, and vice versa. If someone else is fumbling, it's frustrating to you because now you're forced to pause your train of thought where you're at and then try to pick that back up once they pick back up the ball.
I think eventually we will be doing this like, some attorneys are even creating like mock jury or mock rooms, trial rooms. But even for me, if I'm in the same room with like the client, the attorney, like my whole side is in the same room, that can help facilitate some of the conversations that we were doing in the courtroom. And then, so I can envision kind of a happy medium would be like one side on one screen.
Hybrid. Yeah. Listen, I've had situations where counsel and the client are in their counsel's conference room, or I've had the client in my conference room as we're, so I think there's going to be different hybrids of it. I don't think Zoom ever goes away, and we definitely need to sharpen and polish our skills on video testimony and, the changes and the differences.
For all of the negatives that we've addressed about the web interfaces of doing these court proceedings, I think it is beneficial in certain respects also, to where, say, Josh, can have a staff person in the room with him while he's doing this to point out any little detail that may not be at the forefront, right? Because the staff person was in the weeds doing the work. So they're thinking of these things as they hear the questions. And so maybe they're writing them down or however it is, but at least then they can communicate. Those thoughts and ideas can be communicated at the same time in real time while it's going on, instead of, okay, well, you're sitting in the audience and you're taking notes, but you can't deliver those until afterwards. There's no earpiece where you can, fill in.
That's where text becomes pretty important. I'm like, text this question, but it's still like a little weird and awkward. But I think the more you hone your own skills, the more it'll set you apart, because even if it goes and is different in this meantime, because courts are starting to open up a little bit. Some are still not, but some are opening. We're trying to do trials, even judges that were like, heck no, I'm not doing Zoom, are like coming to that because we got to get things moving. Some states have actually said they've just continued and they don't have backlog, but those are random states like North Dakota or South Dakota that haven't really
The less
slowed down.
populous places.
Right. So, I mean, but I think that you always have to check because I don't really ever know if I'm going deep in the middle of Missouri, I might be showing up in person, and not have a problem. And whether it's masked or not, or what are the rigmaroles, I think you got to just make sure But this has been a great conversation. I think it would be helpful if you guys kind of give our audience a little bit about how you could help them if they have questions, or they can reach out to you. Here's your website, but what is your focus? What type of work are you really focused on right now?
Yeah, so the firm is very focused on forensic valuation and tax. We really work with high net worth individuals, but really we like working with small, medium-sized business owners and helping them with taxes. We're moving away from the bookkeeping. We're finding that they can spend better dollars with us on the advising, some of those forward-looking statements. So that's one side of the house. The other side of the house is our forensic and valuation, and we are working in family law, commercial law, criminal law, damages, lost profits, fraud examinations, forensic audits. If there's controversy and it's complex and numbers are involved, that's usually when we can be helpful and beneficial to some party.
That's awesome. And yeah, Stephanie, do you have anything to
add to the tax side? For those small, medium-sized businesses, we like to focus on, business health and the health of the actual organization and where it's going. That way, when you do need evaluation later, you're in a good spot for that, because we never know when those things and situations are going to pop up.
That's awesome. So we've provided all of your contact information, and they can also find it where this video is located. But we really appreciate you both talking about the pandemic economy, which, I think from our standpoint, we don't look at it as good or bad. We just have to look at it as information. And we just try to kind of sift through all of the conflicting information. But thank you guys.
Thank you for having us. We really enjoyed it.